Hi guys, Mrs. Brown here. I'm going to go over our next section, which is we're into the 1960s now. We talked about the Korean War last in the 1950s, and we're actually going to come back to the 1950s in a little bit, but we're going to talk about some of the stuff that got really sketchy in the 1960s. Talking about the Cold War, we've discussed already how we were very close to fighting with the Soviet Union, but neither of us wanted to go to war since we just had gotten finished with World War II. And so this next, 10 to 15 to 20 years with them was pretty sketchy, and this is kind of came to a head here in the early part of the 1960s. So you can kind of see here. I'll pull up the Big Bay of Pigs invasion. This was something that happened, like you said, you can see in 1960, where the CIA decided that they were going to try and help train Cuban rebels who were being taken over by Fidel Castro, and they did not want Castro in charge. And we didn't really want Castro in charge either because he was a communist and he would have been assisted by the Soviet Union. So we helped the Cuban rebels plan an attack on Castro, and it was horrible. It went really bad. It was called Bay of Pigs because of where it happened, and you guys can see here on the next part. This is just the Cuba itself, this 90-mile distance between Florida and Cuba itself, and you can see the Bay of Pigs here. That's where the attack happened. We trained the rebels to attack, and the Castro's forces were able to easily squash the Cuban rebels. It was kind of looked at, like you can see up here again, as a failure on Kennedy's part. We said that we wouldn't do something like this, and then we did. So obviously, this did not look good for the United States. Even though none of our soldiers were in the actual battle, it still looked really bad upon us. Okay. Then you had the Berlin crisis, and again, you can kind of see my horrible, messy drawings here that I did on the smartboard. Kennedy was now kind of going against the new leader of the Soviet Union, who was Nikolai Khrushchev, and they disagreed about Germany, and this is where the whole Soviet Union influence over that portion of Berlin started to happen, and then you had East and West Berlin, which we discussed a little bit, so I won't spend too much time on there, but you can see a picture of the Berlin Wall right there. Then we have the Cuban Missile Crisis, and this is when it really came to a head. Sorry, my computer's going crazy. So on October 1962, the U.S. caught spy planes going over Soviet missile bases in Cuba, and or our spy planes, sorry, caught the Soviets building stuff in Cuba, and we felt that since they were building missile bases so close to us in like our backyard, that we put President Kennedy put everybody on full alert. We were very worried that a war was going to start very soon with the Soviets. We started to prepare for a nuclear war. We were prepared to invade Cuba if we had to, but at the same time we realized that the Soviets were doing the exact same thing. And so President Kennedy went on TV. As you can see, he demanded the Soviets remove the missiles. He put Cuba under something called a naval quarantine, and that word, which we hear so often right now, was a very carefully chosen word. Like it said, if you use the word naval blockade was a war term. So we had to use quarantine instead, which basically meant the same thing. We were just going to cover all of Cuba and make sure that nothing went in or out of there. One Soviet ship crossed the line, but it was stopped because it only had oil on it. Other ships were coming, but at the last second, Khrushchev called them back, which was basically the way we did not have war. So Khrushchev sent Kennedy a letter, and he promised to remove the missiles in Cuba if Kennedy promised to end the quarantine and stay out of Cuba. Then he kind of like second thought himself, and he's like, and I want you to take out your missiles in Turkey, because we ourselves had missiles over in Turkey, which is kind of like in Soviet's backyard. And so Kennedy said, well, I'll take the terms of your first letter, but I'm not agreeing to the terms of the second. So we kept our missiles in Turkey, but we did stay out of Cuba, and they decided to take out their missiles there. So that was an acceptable thing. After that, we signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, where we decided that we were not going to be testing nuclear weapons above ground, and they agreed to it as well. Okay? And there's a picture in the corner there, a political cartoon of, there's both President Kennedy and Khrushchev over a missile, fighting it out. Alliance for Progress, this last year, pretty easy. These are things that President Kennedy was proposing to try and get more things for people in third world nations. And lastly, the Peace Corps is a group that's still around today. This is where we send volunteers, usually to third world nations, to help develop those areas. And you can volunteer to do that even today. Your stuff is paid for. You just go there and volunteer your services.